Good afternoon from Jordan, and welcome to this session hosted by the United Nations Development Programme as part of UN Behavioural Science Week, which kicked off yesterday and will be full of interesting sessions hosted by different UN agencies until this Friday, 10th of June. Last year, UN Secretary General Guterres issued a guidance note urging UN agencies to make use of behavioural science to enhance the effectiveness of their work. And this week, an accompanying implementation guide will be launched that offers more in-depth guidance to UN staff on how to go about integrating behavioural science in their work. But back to our session. My name is Roxani Rochas, and I'm pleased to be here on behalf of UNDP's Regional Innovation Team in the Arab States. In this session, we'll be looking at how behavioural science can add value to entrepreneurship development efforts. It's a topic we've been researching with 10 UNDP country offices in the Arab States and with the Behavioural Insights team since last year. The motivation for this work was that entrepreneurship was an underexplored area for applying behavioural science at UNDP, despite the fact that practically all our country offices do some kind of work on entrepreneurship that could benefit from the complementary lens of behavioural science. So from this work, we've derived a toolkit that is aimed at entrepreneurship practitioners and policymakers such as yourselves that we'll be presenting for the first time today. Before we get started, I'd like to launch a quick Zoom poll. So you should see it popping up on your screen now. And I have two questions for you. So question one, successful entrepreneurship is primarily attributable to innate characteristics and aspirations, or it can be learned. And second question, overcoming behavioral barriers to entrepreneurship is the responsibility of the individual entrepreneur, or can be the responsibility of other actors in the ecosystem as well. I see some answers streaming in. I'll give it another few moments. Okay. So we see the majority of answers here on screen are can be learned and can be the responsibility of other actors in the ecosystem, but some answers, some different answers as well. The first thing to note is that entrepreneurship can be broken down into a series of behaviors, whether preparing a business plan, attending an entrepreneurship training, or registering a business, applying for a loan, or completing daily bookkeeping tasks. But there are a number of psychological barriers that can get in the way of these behaviors, such as negative emotions linked to fear of failure, or conversely also overconfidence in one's abilities as an entrepreneur. But to answer a little bit the first question in the poll, the evidence does show that it is possible to learn to overcome these kinds of psychological barriers at an individual level. But what happens then when a business registration process is excruciatingly lengthy and costly, or when a woman entrepreneur is discriminated against by a financial institution when applying for a loan, or even when a UN training program is designed in a way that unconsciously excludes persons with disabilities? And this overcoming barriers to entrepreneurship becomes the responsibility of other actors in the ecosystem as well. And where dissecting the challenge from a behavioral perspective can help to pinpoint why it is that our policies and programs are not actually translating into observable behaviors and how they might be better designed. So to delve into some of these questions today, we're joined by a very complimentary set of speakers who I'd like to thank very much for their time. We'll first be hearing from Professor Dr. Michael Frese. He is a psychologist and behavioral scientist, expert in organizational psychology in particular. He is the most cited entrepreneurship and management researcher in the Asia Pacific region, and one of the most cited in the rest of the world. He is a member of the German Academy of Sciences and received a Lifetime Achievement Award last year from the Organizational Behavior Division of the Academy of Management. Later on in the session, we'll turn to our partners, the Behavioural Insights team, with whom we've been working since last year on researching the application of behavioural science to UNDP's entrepreneurship programs in 10 countries in the Arab states, as I mentioned earlier. And they will be presenting a toolkit that we are very proud to be launching this week that shares methods and lessons learned from the research we've undertaken together. To share her experience of applying the methods put forward in the toolkit, we'll also have a chance to hear from my colleague at UNDP Lebanon, Leuphana Asia. Now, throughout the session, don't hesitate to share your comments and questions with us using the Q&A function. But over to you, Professor Frese. I'd like to start with a question about your extensive research that has repeatedly highlighted the value of taking a psychology-based approach to supporting entrepreneurship. Could you tell us a bit more about what that means in practice?
Yes, can I start out with, can you see my slide? It's a crazy slide. And I wanted you to see this crazy slide because that shows all the behavioral indicators that are related to success factors in entrepreneurship. So it's a complex area. But I don't want to talk about the whole slide. I want to talk about one particular thing off the slide, and that is the connection between action characteristics and entrepreneurial success. And the reason why I concentrate on that is because whenever you talk about personality, there are innate factors in personality. But when you talk about the action characteristics, you can change them. And that's why I think it's very useful to sort of look at the action characteristics. And of course, this is going to be slightly different from an economic point of view that often emphasizes the environmental factor. You see the green connection here. But we don't believe in that. We believe that everything always goes via the actions of the entrepreneurs. So without the actions of the entrepreneurs, there's nothing. Okay, obviously in extreme environments, the environment will completely determine the actions to some extent. And then, of course, you're in a different situation. So enough said about this complexity. We are concentrating now on one aspect, and that's the idea of personal initiative. And personal initiative, in a way, is three things. It's self-starting, future orientation, and overcoming barriers. Let me just say what that means for the entrepreneurs. Self-starting means I want to be different from the normal or obvious approach. This is, of course, context dependent. In this area in which I am, I want to be different than others. I don't want to do the obvious. I want to start with things that are somewhat different and somewhat new and somewhat innovative. The second point is future orientation. I want to scan potential opportunities and problems that may appear in the future and prepare for them now. And of course, also think about feedback so that I can think of long-term usefulness of the product and services. And finally, overcoming barriers. You were talking about how often we are restricting ourselves because we are frustrated, we are anxious, etc., etc. So this self-regulation part is overcoming barriers, but also we have to overcome barriers in the world, and there are lots of them for entrepreneurs. And so we did a training that was geared on personal initiative, and we compared it to another training and to a no training control group. So this was a randomized control group design, and it was done by the World Bank. And they had a business edge training that was accounting and financial management, human resource management, commercial management, the typical business type of thing, but oriented towards the African environment because we were doing that in Togo. The personal initiative training was self-starting, innovation, goal setting. In terms of financial planning, we said don't wait for banks, do bootstrapping, essentially. Of overcoming barriers, it's the same thing that I just described. what we found was, it's published, so I can be very short. What we found is that the monthly profits were raised quite strongly in the personal initiative training. And there was a significant difference between the traditional business training and to the personal initiative training. The traditional business training was not significantly different from the control group. You can see here, we had, of course, several measures across 2 years. And you see at the very end, there's actually a maximization of the differences between the different groups. And the personal initiative group, that's this one here. That's this one. You see that it was quite high. What were we doing? We were developing rules of thumbs. We were using a learning by doing approach, but not a blind one. And that's related again to the rules of thumb that often come from scientific studies. We were transferring the action principle to the individual context, and we were encouraging people to make errors on the way towards goals. And of course, we tried to routinize the behavior as well. So this was one training. Another training was oriented towards business, BA students, I'm sorry, not business, BA students who were not business students. And we trained them in essence to be interested in entrepreneurship and use that as a potential career choice. And this was a training we developed quite some time ago in Uganda. And if you look at the effects, we have by now we have had 17,000 people who participated in this training from 22 universities in 11 countries, and also high school students. What we found is that the business training, the step training, leads to more business creation, also over time, long time perspective, and that the STEP students, those people who participated in the STEP training, had a 39% more jobs created in 2 years' time. So this is nice, and I don't want to talk too much about anything else, but just leave it at this. So what you see is a behavioral approach, action-oriented approach that is relatively strong and has potential positive effects. Now, I tell more about that later when it comes to policy implications.
Thank you, Professor. Some questions are starting to pop up in the chat. Thank you for those. Please keep them coming in the Q&A function. We'll be taking them later on in the session. Just to answer one question that came up, yes, the recording of the session will be shared following the session. And we'll also put in, Professor Frese has kindly shared with us some of his publications that we'll share with you in the chat for further reference. Professor Frese, thank you for those interesting insights from your work testing out the impact of entrepreneurship training programs. In the UN system, in addition to delivering entrepreneurship training programs, we do also work at the policy level on the ease of doing business, to improve access to finance for marginalized entrepreneurs and more. So based on your research, how would you recommend that we as development practitioners use behavioral science to improve outcomes at those different levels?
The most obvious, it's difficult. Okay, so policy implications are always difficult for somebody who is a little more oriented towards individuals' behaviors. Yeah? And therefore, the first one is, of course, always just do it again, do the training again. Okay, and this is what we did with the World Bank. As you see, the strongly colored parts of the world is where the World Bank has now been using the PI training. And it doesn't always work as well as in Togo, I should say that too. But in principle, it's a system that works to increase productivity. Now, the training is good. Now, the big question is, how can you scale up training? Scaling up training can be done in many different ways. One way to do that is, of course, I just kicked this out for a second. One way to do that is, of course, that you scale up the trainings done. And so what we try to do more and more now is to get those trainers to actually start businesses that produces training again, so that they become that it becomes a rolling approach where they help people to develop better approaches in entrepreneurship. The second big thing is, of course, that we also want people to do things as much as possible, and that we don't necessarily always want to give them a choice between psychological training and business training. One of the bigger problems that we find is whenever we are giving people a choice, they would invariably say business training is more important for us than a psychological mindset training, even though it's not true. Yeah? So the point is, we need to have good examples, sort of good case studies. And if you want to, I can show you at least one little case study that the World Bank has produced on our study in Togo. So this is all still individual. It becomes a little more organizational when we talk about universities. Universities can sort of require a course in entrepreneurship in an action-oriented way. It's not helping at all to just teach entrepreneurship as a subject. That's not helping. It's helping only to teach entrepreneurship in an action-oriented way. So first day, you start a business. And the second day, we are thinking about how to make it better, etc. So you don't start with I explain everything beforehand and then I let you go. You start immediately with the action and you correct the action. That's why this error element is so important. We want to make errors. We want to also be wrong to find out where we can be right. So this is the level of university vocational colleges, and it's working. It's working, not always and not as much as we want to, but in principle, there are colleges in Uganda that have been using it consistently, and in the Philippines. Skill development can also be tied to everything else, microcredits, formalizing an organization. We have shown that formal organizations in large informal environments, informal organizational environments, that formal organizations are only good if they also have high personal initiative. We also show recently that farming skills are taught to farmers are only used really well if they also get a personal initiative training. So we can tie it to this thing. Of course, we want this validated. We want to be sure that this really works, because otherwise you're just frustrating people. You make them hot and then nothing comes out. So that's why it's very important that these are always evidence-based kinds of trainings. Okay, also in economic or internet-based programs, we're starting to do more of this kind of stuff. At the moment, we always want to combine that. Obviously, we also want to have much more on the internet itself. It's important that one should not combine the two trainings. So I suggest not to combine the business training with a psychological training, because we found that typically the message gets muddled. If they have separate trainings, it works well. Yeah. So I want to have people who have a separate training here and then a separate training here. And I just want to tell them, do both, because both are complementary at the end. The last point is develop an entrepreneurial culture, celebrate small business and support everything that's around it, internationalizing, marketing, upgrading product and service quality, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this is the general idea. So this is my take on it. And in essence, then, it's always related back to some kind of individual mindset approach. Oh God, I'm so bad. Roxanne asked me to send her 3 articles. I sent her 5. I cannot help myself. I put a lot more down here if you want to. It doesn't matter, okay? That's all I wanted to say right now.
Thank you so much, and yes, we'll be putting those in the chat in just a moment. And thanks for the really actionable insights, Professor. We've also been asked to share the YouTube link that you had on the previous chat, so
yeah.
we can circulate that later on alongside the recording.
This is a fantastic YouTube link that the World Bank produced on people who participated in it and are talking about the training retrospectively. Yeah, this is all on personal initiative training. You won't hear my name at all because I was on the I was only the person who was doing it. You know, who was training the trainers. Okay, so actually I was training my PhD students to be the trainers of the trainers. It's even more complicated than that. That's all. But you will see it in action, so that's nice. It's just 4 minutes.
Thank you so much, Professor, and hopefully we'll have time to take questions that are starting to stream in at the end of the session. If you could stop sharing your screen, I will now turn to our colleagues from the Behavioural Insights team. So we have Monica Wills Silva with us, as well as, sorry, just give me a moment to bring them here on screen with me. We have Monica Wills Silva with us, who is the head of international programs for Europe, Middle East and Africa at the Behavioural Insights team, as well as her colleague Melissa Portilla. They'll be walking us through the Behavioural Insights Toolkit for Entrepreneurship Programming that we've been working on together and that UNDP is really proud to be launching this week. So Monica, Melissa, thanks for being with us, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Roxani, and thank you so much, UNDP, for the invitation to share this toolkit with everyone today, following the great presentation from Professor Frese, who actually inspired quite a bit of this work. So quite a bit of what we did here was revising the literature that you've provided, which is very useful. And we're very excited to be launching this toolkit today. It's been the culmination of a 1-year program of work that Roxani mentioned at the start with the UNDP Innovation Regional Office in the Arab States, as well as 10 country offices. We've been going through a capacity building program, doing a bit of a learning by doing approach, taking all the country offices through the steps of the methodology that we've captured in the toolkit. And the idea behind the toolkit is just to provide a bit of like actionable steps for anyone wanting to work on entrepreneurship programming, be that policymakers, be that program designers, be that the entrepreneurs themselves, and make this evidence very accessible in almost like a checklist format. So I'm just going to take you through a bit of an overview of the toolkit, and then I'll pass it on to my colleague Melissa, who will take you through a very concrete example of some of the tools that we've developed within this. And finally, we'll hand it over to Lilian, who will actually take you through how it is like from the perspective of a practitioner to use this toolkit, which is fantastic to have both approaches today. And so the toolkit actually is like largely inspired by our methodological framework test, which is this framework that we developed to apply behavioral insights to programs, to apply behavioral insights to policy challenges. The idea and the first step behind this toolkit is very in line with what Professor Frese was mentioning, which is basically trying to break a complex policy challenge like increasing entrepreneurship or encouraging entrepreneurship into very concrete actionable behavioral steps, like, for instance, preparing a business plan, like Roxani mentioned, or, for example, completing a bookkeeping task or signing up to a training program for entrepreneurship. So it's almost mapping out what are those very concrete steps or behaviors that we consider desirable within the entrepreneurship journey. Once we've done that, once we have an idea of what that target behavior should be and what our interest group is, be that In the case specifically of the toolkit, we're thinking a lot more about youth entrepreneurship and female entrepreneurship, but you might have other target groups in mind. The idea is that you now try and take their perspective. This is almost like an exploratory phase, a formative phase where you're trying to understand what are the barriers to the behaviors that we consider desirable. So if it's something like increasing business plans or encouraging entrepreneurs to start a business plan, you try and understand what are the barriers behind the fact that we're not seeing those business plans happening. What is the perspective from the entrepreneurs? And we try and map out those barriers. So Melissa will take you through some of the cards that we've designed to help aid that process in identifying those barriers. After you have an idea of what the barriers are like, and you've got the evidence behind both from the literature as well as the context, because the idea is that this is all quite context relevant research that you're creating here. It's addressing the local needs. It's not just inspired by the broader literature in behavioral science and entrepreneurship. Then you go into designing a behaviorally informed solution, an intervention. And in this case, we've created some cards, again, as an aid to help brainstorming sessions in terms of like what interventions that have strong enough evidence from the literature you could apply in this space that could address the behaviors that we consider desirable in order to promote entrepreneurship within a specific context. And so Melissa will also take you there. Now, the next step that we included is a more concrete, tangible one. So once you've got a solution, an idea, a broader idea that you want to design in terms of a behavioral intervention, the idea in this stage, the fourth stage, is to prototype it. And by that, we mean is to create either a low fidelity or a high fidelity prototype, a version of your intervention that then you test qualitatively with the groups of interest. So you get a sense of, is this appropriate? Does it use the appropriate vocabulary? Are my target population understanding what we mean where we're communicating these ideas? You also get some feedback on the implementation side of things. Is this actually feasible or as feasible as we thought it would be when we were designing it initially? And through those inputs, you then refine that intervention before you go into the final stage, which is basically piloting your intervention. It's thinking about what are the things that we need to capture in order to make sure that we're not only designing this intervention that is relevant for the context, addresses some entrepreneurship barriers, but also that we can test rigorously in a way that allows us to learn as we go and allows us to expand the evidence base of what's relevant within this context. So the idea is that this takes us from a broader challenge like entrepreneurship into narrowing it down into actions and concrete behaviors, then learning from the context and the literature as much as we can to design an intervention, and then creating an iterative approach whereby we're prototyping and testing at the end of it. And now I'll hand it over to Melissa, who will take you through some of the concrete tools that we created for this toolkit.
Thank you very much, Moni, for this general walkthrough. I'm going to go a little bit more into detail of the form and the structure of the toolkit. And just to show you a quick example on how each tool contained in this toolkit is presented, I'm going to show you the first one, that is the behavioral map. So first of all, you have the presentation of the tool. What is it? How does it work? What is the objective? And why to use it? After that, it's followed by an activity sheet. And all the green frame pages on the toolkit are activities, exercises that will help you to understand and build your project. So this guide in addition to all the instructions, it has also examples on how can each activity be completed. To add to these examples and along with these activities, you'll also find tips and testimonials. So these lessons learned and tips actually come from the UNDP country offices that participated in the program. So this is basically how each tool of the toolkit is presented. So I wanted, among all the activities and the tools on the kit, I just wanted to emphasize on one particularly. So as Monica told you before, we created a deck of cards, a deck of barrier and solution cards. So for this tool, we used as a base the BIT East cards and barrier cards. Some of you might know this already, but this card summarizes behavioral concepts within behavioral frameworks like the Combi model. And we took these cards a step further, and based on the literature review that we did and on Professor Frese's work, we created a similar tool of cards, but completely specific to entrepreneurship. So this deck is really part of the toolkit and is, as Moni said, is to be used in stage 2 and 3, but also can be standing alone to animate workshops or brainstorming sessions. So this deck contains 15 cards summarizing really barriers to entrepreneurship. Each card is illustrated and explains a behavioral concept. Like this, for example, choice overload. We know from the literature that we have limited cognitive resources to process complex information and to weigh up pros and cons. And this can be particularly true in the context of entrepreneurship when registering a business, for example. And this can lead to entrepreneurs making poor decisions or not making decisions at all. So this is one barrier. We have identified 15 of them that you can find on this deck. And to counteract these barriers, we also designed 10 solution cards. So these 10 different levers can be used to create behaviorally informed interventions. So there is not one solution to each barrier, because some of the solutions can counter several barriers or can also be combined into one intervention, but above all, it has to be also very contextualized. Here you have an example, simplify application forms. This is something that we have seen and we will see this week on the panels of the Behavioral Science Week. And all the panelists are talking about simplification of processes, and it's one of the solution cards. So a little bit of a conclusion on this deck. So this deck is part of the toolkit, and really you can use it as a tool, as a brick, as a methodological brick itself, standing alone. Maybe to conclude a little bit, as Professor Frese said, and as Monica also explained, promoting entrepreneurship can help to reduce unemployment and enhance economic growth and recovery. And taking this behavioral approach can improve the design, the delivery, and the evaluation of entrepreneurship policies, also communication, programs, and services in general. So the aim of this toolkit that we did is to equip development practitioners and programmers, but also project designers or project managers, with very practical tools to develop behaviorally informed interventions. Overall, but also to everyone that is interested in designing behaviorally informed interventions. So what does this toolkit contains? As you saw, this is really a step-by-step guide to build a BI informed intervention. It contains knowledge and why and how to conduct a BI project, and really from targeting a behavior to designing and test the intervention. You can find inside tools as behavioral maps, user journey, and the famous deck of cards, of course. But then on a very practical level, this toolkit is an interactive PDF file. That means you can fill it and save it as you go along, advancing on your project, doing the activities, saving it, opening it again. It can be then used as a journal, as a guide throughout the BI intervention project. As Monica said, this is an iterative process, so you don't have to be afraid to go and do the same step several times, change it and do it again. And the second remark is that of course, this toolkit is presented as a path, but it contains methodological bricks that you can use as you want, and you can you can also use it in different projects and on other projects. So we hope that the practical resources, activities, and examples in this kit will provide you guidance throughout your own BI entrepreneurship projects. Maybe to really conclude and finish, I really want to say thank you to all the people that contributed to the creation of the kit. So first, a big thank to UNDP practitioners that participated to the program from Djibouti, Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, Libya, Morocco, Somalia, Sudan, Syria, and Tunisia. But also a very important thank you to Roxani and Jennifer Colville for carrying the program. And maybe it's time for me to pass the presentation to Lilian Abuzeki, that was part of the program and that is going to talk to us a little bit more about the experience and how to apply how was it to apply this methodology to a real concrete project. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa. I just want to second thanking Roxani. You've really pushed through for this one. And I know that there are a lot of online kits and there are a lot of things that we are exposed to as practitioners that kind of create this cognitive overwhelm and kind of create some kind of paralysis, to kind of link back to what Michael was saying in the beginning. And I really think that this toolkit, if you guys want to look at it, it is that self-starting space. So to borrow from Dr. Michael, for us to self-start or kind of increase our self-efficacy, we just went through those interactive exercises over a period of, I don't know, many weeks. I don't want to kind of misname, but what I'm going to walk through and how I'm going to show it is the way as a UN development practitioner in this setting that may have some particular constraints and boundaries, how we applied it. Okay, so that's the angle I'm going from. And of course, feel free to share questions as we said. And I'm just going to share my screen now. Just let me know if you see it. And I'm happy to share a modified version of this presentation later, if you let me know.
We can see it.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Roxani. So as the team has already mentioned, this is the original brief. We worked with many other Arab countries, and we started at stage 1, which is selecting a behavioral target. We knew that we wanted, it was myself and the general analyst for the office, Sausan Nurallah. Basically, we wanted to work within the boundaries of a women economic empowerment program where we already had some boundaries that are set forward for us. The context of the country really matters here. Lebanon was going through crisis upon crisis and has become a fragile setting. And women entrepreneurs, particularly amongst other entrepreneurs, were suffering from the increasing price of the dollar on a daily basis, and I think 250% of inflation so far. So basically, at the time when we started doing this Paving the Path to Successful Youth Entrepreneurship study, we decided to kind of let go of bottlenecks that we cannot control, like government, banks. Banks are failing. We cannot get our monies out. We will not target the banking kind of equation. We will not kind of target particularly anything that would bottleneck us within the governmental system at this time, because we had no influence over there. So what we decided to do was partner up with our partner Berry Tech and interview 19 women entrepreneurs from across Lebanon. And with over 67 pages of the interviews, which is mainly how we use the BIT framework and the BI barrier cards to kind of influence how we ask our questions, we were able to kind of really funnel down to what Monica was saying was really, instead of just women entrepreneurs and what's blocking them and all the typical ways that we funnel money into these programs on and on, doing the same thing, but not really seeing different results, we noticed that out of the 19 entrepreneurs, whether she's on FreshBooks, which is a very sophisticated cloud-based Excel, like kind of a bookkeeping program, or if she uses pen and paper, or if she has her accountant who's outsourced and she pays, or if she has her own Excel sheet, they all, bar none, had used the same word to describe their own bookkeeping efforts. They said, whatever I do is very basic, I'm sure. And from that point, triangulating it and kind of layering it up with more of the steps that the kit walked us through and more of the desk research that we found around communicating about money, confidence around money, and self-efficacy when it comes to actual bookkeeping and its relationship or correlation with successful entrepreneurship. We went on to stage 2 around understanding this particular target and the behavior that we want to encounter. So if we can see that this is already the area that we want to highlight, where in this process do we want to intervene? We kind of did a data overlay from a 15-year-long research by Anna Maria Lusardi that basically tested, again, to go back to what Dr. Michael said, control group, not control groups. When women are presented with these 3 questions that basically Anna Maria, has concluded to give signals of fiscal kind of proficiency, whenever she introduced refuse to answer or do not know, much more women were likely to choose that over men, which kind of highlighted that at least 1/3 of the gender gap is due to confidence versus competence or self-efficacy when it comes to bookkeeping or fiscal hygiene. Knowing that fiscal hygiene and bookkeeping is a huge marker for whether an entrepreneur is successful or not, regardless of gender. We went on to stage 3, which is designing a behaviorally informed intervention itself, knowing that we had a very short period of time and these 19 entrepreneurs, which is the boundary that we set for ourselves. We decided to kind of produce this, this little Google survey tool kind of thing, which basically puts just 2 simple questions and utilizes the threshold that we're experiencing right now, that any kind of entrepreneur in Lebanon has to revise their prices on a weekly, if not daily basis because of the dollar to lira gap. And then we would ask them through our partners reminder on WhatsApp every week, what is your unit costing you? How much are you selling it? And kind of putting in some BI techniques that we got through the solution cards to get them through a financial shot of their kind of fiscal hygiene or bookkeeping. So basically, based on the results of that kind of prototype, and because we're in the Accelerator Lab network, which implies that we can learn from across the world, we also looked at what other people were doing, like in Mauritius. And we also looked at a 15-country results dashboard that our team in the Accelerator Lab has recently produced that also links the idea of why formality is also linked to digital tools. And we kind of decided that we want to target the particular act or the particular moment where women are doing this very mundane activity to basically update their prices or actually just keep up with their bookkeeping, but target the behavior around becoming ready and confident in your bookkeeping by making sure that you understand what you're doing and you have the confidence in actually the way you communicate about money. So while we did that and the results from our first prototype just showed us that it can be a bit overwhelming to actually go into bookkeeping or any kind of financial activity, whether it's Excel or otherwise, we also went deeper into the research with coaches that actually coached these 19 entrepreneurs. And a common moment that they all said changed the trajectory of women in these programs is the moment when they get to sit down with a one-to-one mentor and they give them their own personalized Excel sheet and give them that knowledge one-to-one. So we kind of decided to scale that process into a micro email course, which can become then a testable environment across all of our perhaps women economic empowerment programs, where we can, one, match the knowledge with the particular profile, and also tap onto this inflection point in the particular trajectory. So this is kind of where we are right now, but basically it's a place where we can test whether our assumption and our mode of inquiry has been correct or not, or actually what is it about self-paced learning and kind of downloading these templates would help these women in their effort to become better entrepreneurs. So just gonna go over to you, Roxani, so that I don't kind of exceed time, but happy to talk about it later. Over.
Thank you so much, Liliane. And thank you, BIT colleagues, as well for the earlier presentation. Just to clarify, the toolkit will be shared with you all following the session by email. It will be accompanied by the customized barrier and solution cards that that Melissa showed us. And the audience of the target group is really not entrepreneurs themselves, though some of the principles that the toolkit, of course, is based on can be very valuable for entrepreneurs as well. But the target group really here is entrepreneurship practitioners who are implementing different kinds of entrepreneurship interventions. There are some questions in the chat. I wanted to maybe ask BIT colleagues and Liliane, if you had one top tip in terms of how to get started using the toolkit, how to identify kind of the right entry point for using behavioral science in entrepreneurship practice, what would that be?
I'm happy to go first, Liliane, if that's okay. Cool, that sounds good. It's very hard to narrow it down to just one tip, Roxani, but I would say the target part of the toolkit is very important and is potentially the one that we tend to underestimate how difficult it can be to select the one target behavior to focus on. So I would say spend a good amount of time thinking through what are the behaviors, mapping them out. And then once you have that, the thing that we tend to do at BID, which is also explained within the toolkit, is factoring in things like feasibility and social impact, right? Like how much impact based on the evidence that you have, you think you can achieve through focusing on a specific behavior, as well as like how feasible is this in practice? Is this something that we can actually create without a lot of disruptions? Because as you can see from a lot of these interventions, we're not aiming to change a program as a whole. We're not aiming to do structural changes around entrepreneurship programs. We're aiming to do marginal improvements with what's already there. So visibility is quite an important element of figuring out where to start, right? Like you kind of want to balance both things in a way that allows you to get to a place where you can create an intervention and for an intervention to be as evidence-based as possible with the potential for impact. So that would be my main advice, like balance those two and think carefully about the target. And then once you've done that, think about this iteratively as well. Like don't shy away from coming back to the target stage if when you're exploring, you've figured out that the barrier is not quite right, or you're not focusing in the behavior, or you decided to focus on something like the business plan, but in reality, you're struggling with uptake of the program as a whole to start with. So like you can go back to the drawing board and start with that behavior instead. So this is, it feels linear, but I encourage people to take it in an iterative way, if that makes sense. And I don't know if Liliane, you want to complement anything of that?
Yeah, thank you so much, Monica. I think for our example, if we just go back to that, where we started was we understood the boundaries of our experiment and what we're trying to understand. It came through that bookkeeping and kind of fiscal hygiene or preparedness is something that women particularly struggle with because of our interview process. They all said their conception of what they do is quite basic. So the way we tried to prototype on that is by giving them some like, here, this is an easy tool to kind of be on top of your prices every week. But that didn't necessarily work in the way that we wanted it to, but doesn't mean that we didn't learn from it. We learned that even though we can see that this is a clear problem in the knowledge space or the perception space of their confidence, what we need to do is kind of go back to that drawing board. And that's kind of when we tapped into the interviews with the coaches. They were women coaches, and on average, each of these women coaches had 300 women coached every year. And that's when we kind of went into the insight that the inflection point in most of these training programs that we fund for a lot of these women economic empowerment programs is when you put a woman with a one-to-one teacher who's able to chunk down this very massive information and match her with the right Excel tool that she often goes on to use for years to come. Like they follow up with her like 2-3 years down the line. She's using the same Excel sheet. So that's when we kind of reiterated our prototype for this prototype number 2 that also takes into account the environment around women, which is they don't have time. A lot of these women wake up at 5 to do bookkeeping. So we kind of put all of those together into our next test, which is the micro email course, which is a much more scaled version of this environment/behaviors that we're trying to test.
Can I add something here?
Of course.
Yeah, I really liked the cards. Wonderful. There's so much. On the other hand, there's so much, and you're pointing out the importance of coaching. There's so much misunderstandings often. So you would imagine that something like self-starting is clear. You know, you start yourself, yeah? And it's not from somebody else and whatever. But it's very hard to really understand what that really means in the specifics. And the same thing also for bookkeeping. Now, I'm a little more worried about concentrating on bookkeeping, quite frankly, because I think bookkeeping comes with it. So we found, strangely, and to the surprise of everyone, we found that if we teach personal initiative, and we don't teach bookkeeping one bit, if we teach personal initiative, they actually become better in their bookkeeping. Because what they are doing is they say, I want to be better in everything. You know, I want to improve everything. And I know I know I should just write things down, you know, and I shouldn't take money out of the cash that is in the cashier, etc. You know, they know that already to some extent, no, but they don't practice it necessarily. So bookkeeping comes along. So it may be an indicator, but it comes along with a more mature entrepreneurial orientation in a way. Yeah. But at the same time, and I was wondering how you deal with that. At the same time, I find it often so difficult. Like this competency-based approach that McClellan started, and that's wonderful, it's so difficult because each competence is so often easily misunderstood that I was wondering how you do that and how you keep people intact. And the last question that I have, do you have a randomized controlled experiment on your study, on your approach? If not, then do it.
Michael, are those for me or
for anyone?
Yeah, so I guess I can jump in very briefly just to answer that last point. When we go into like the piloting stage of the toolkit, that's what we're encouraging. It's like piloting in small scale first if you don't have the technical skills to run a full-on randomized control trial, but the idea being to build the evidence through very rigorous scientific methods as possible. Because I completely agree with you. If anything, it's just pushing like the boundaries to make sure we're building evidence as we go in this space as well.
Mm-hmm.
And for particularly this example of a micro email course, while I completely agree that bookkeeping in itself, it becomes almost trivial as a competence that we're trying to check off. It's the occasion of bookkeeping that we found useful as a common denominator between all these women, and hoping that if we do our kind of matchmaking properly from our grounded experience in all this women economic programming, we kind of identified 4 profiles of women who tend to take these programs. We want to go all out with a quasi-randomized control trial, I would say, because what we're going to try to do is basically tackle thousands of entrepreneurs in Lebanon, kind of segregate our targeting just for women, and see if women are able to match themselves with the right kind of micro email course, and then see their progress along the way, and then do an end line as well, somehow in that kind of online experience. So quasi, I would say, but definitely looking forward, and anything you have to share in terms of feedback would be great.
I think it would be. I've done lots and lots, at least 20 or 30 pilot studies on this personal initiative training. And quite frankly, I do agree that you learn a lot from these quasi-experimental type of approaches. But at some point in time, you want to know whether you're really right, and that's where you need a randomized control group design. Sorry, because that's the only place where you can also fail, and we have failed. Okay, and the failing has been as important teaching us as the successes. Okay. By the way, the failing we have tried to publish, and nobody takes it. Nobody likes to publish a failed approach. because we can actually show that the failed approach was related to what you were referring to, and some people in the Q&A were referring to, that trainers sometimes are not so good, and the coaches are sometimes not so good. And it depends quite strongly on how good they are as well. And that makes it all the more complicated, obviously. Yeah.
Professor Frese, thank you for those insights, and this is also partially why we rely on academics such as yourself to share the evidence from randomized control trials, which we're sometimes able to run in the UN system, but very often we don't have the resources to do those in their original form.
Yeah, we should compare them. We should just compare them. You don't even need a control group anymore. We just compare two different trainings.
But because we're running out of time, I just wanted to come back to one of the earlier questions that were posed to you, which was you mentioned the suggestion that it can be counterproductive to combine business and personal initiative training in one. So there was a question around whether the ordering matters. How do you sequence different kinds of trainings? Is there any evidence around that?
If I'm not mistaken, I'm not absolutely certain now. We did one experiment where we randomized the order and it didn't matter. So the order did not matter. But the combination was less good than a pure personal initiative. So it was significantly different. And I was wondering back then, why that should be so. And I think the problem is the following. I go into a training with certain expectations, and people don't always know what they need to actually change. So often people are not, if you ask them, are you going to change your actions? Are you going to change your behavior a lot? And people will say, no, I'm doing all right, it's okay. But then once you see that they do get a behavioral approach, then you see that they actually explode in terms of profitability, in comparison to something where they get to know exactly what they are searching for, and where they get really good business advice, and where they just don't, where they don't use it then later on. Do you get my point? We need to pull them into action. We have to unleash the action part. And that's why if you give two messages, use these business, which are all useful, you use these business skills and do personal initiative, it just gets muddled, and you don't do either at the end. I don't know whether that's true, by the way, but this is my impression at this moment from the one study where we did compare a combination with a pure psychological approach.
Thank you very much. We'd love to continue this conversation, but we're running out of time. We certainly very excited to continue working with our country offices in this area as UNDP Arab states. And we're also very keen to hear others' experiences using this toolkit, which, as I mentioned before, we'll be sharing very soon. So do get in touch and share with us your own learning in this space. No gun.
Behind the entrepreneur.
And I just wanted to remind you also that this is just one of many sessions happening this week as part of UN Behavioral Science Week. I'm putting the link to the agenda in the chat right now so that you can make sure to follow some of the other sessions as well. And particularly on Friday, UNDP will be involved in two other sessions, one on this question of how do we go about applying behavioral science in our organizations, perpetual question in which Gina Lucarelli from UNDP Accelerator Labs will be speaking. And we'll also have another session the same day with UNDP's Crisis Bureau, where they share some work that they've done on behaviors that promote collaboration and UN integration more on an internal level. So very interesting sessions coming up. I just want to thank all the speakers so much for sharing their insights today. Maybe just to give you all a chance to say any parting words just very shortly. Maybe Monica, starting with you.
That sounds good. Thank you so much, Roxani, for a fascinating discussion. I wish I could stay on the line talking to Professor Frese about all his research and how it combines with the toolkit that we've created. But this is just the start of it, right? Like we're keen to hear your feedback. We're keen to find opportunities to apply the toolkit to build this rigorous evidence. So do get in touch. We're available to talk more about this, and we'll love to keep the conversation going.
Elissa?
Absolutely. Thank you very much for your attention, for all the super questions and the great discussion, Professor and Lilian and everybody. Also, one last word, iteration, as Monica said, don't hesitate to try and try and try again. And as Professor said, errors are also knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you, Lilian.
Thanks a lot, guys. This was a great conversation, and so much of my mind is already working up different ways that we can kind of engineer our next test. So thank you so much, all of you. Cheers.
And last but not least, Professor Frese.
Thank you so much. So this is wonderful. This is really, really good. And thank you so much for your effort, for this fantastic set of cards. I want to see them. I'm burning to see them. It's wonderful, and we should work together at some point in time. It would be really nice. Thank you so much. Yeah, it was really nice, and thanks, Roxana, for putting us together and keeping us nearly in time.
We'd love to stay engaged as well. So thank you very much, Professor Frese, and thank you to all speakers, and stay tuned and stay in touch. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Have a good rest of your day. Bye.